When I was young, I became a sailing addict. I stole my father's little skiff one time up in Dredge Harbor, the northern part of Delaware River. He had built this little skiff and he was quite proud of it. And I borrowed one of my mother's bed sheets and I took a broom handle out of the closet and I rigged this thing in my father's little skiff. And I sailed across Dredge Harbor to the other side. I got to the other side and I landed on the beach over there and I realized I had to row all the way back. I thought, gee, this sailing business, they must be out of their minds. I've got to find a different way to do this. But I became more and more of a sailor, and I realized eventually how I could sail back again, and that opened up a whole new avenue of experimentation for me. After my father had passed away and trying to support my mother, I decided I was going to get into the sailing game. I had a 44-foot yawl that two of my friends and I had bought together down in the Chesapeake, and I decided I'd take it to the Bahamas and get in the charter business. So I was down there for 3 years trying to make a living in the charter business and working on other boats in order to do so, just try and earn enough money to keep alive. And a man came walking down the dock while I was working on somebody else's boat doing some varnishing, and he got to talking to me and we discussed the fact that he had a couple of schooners in Maine. Of course, that perked me right up. Well, tell me about these schooners. Well, these were two old commercial schooners that were part of the old Swift fleet back in those days. They were the only two surviving out of the 18 vessels that Captain Frank Swift, had back in those days. Well, it was the Maddie and the Mercantile back in those days. The Maddie now has a new name, the Grace Bailey, because she's been all rebuilt. But in those days, it was the Maddie and the Mercantile, two old schooners. Well, he's looking around for captains for these boats because his captains were getting old. So I said, boy, this seems like right in my line. We laid my vessel up for the summer and I came to Maine. Windjammer is a term for these great big schooners. It's a term that has been adulterated down through the ages. It was a derogatory term, and the great big square riggers would come back from Australia and China, and they would be coming up the English Channel, and the steamers always had to give way to the sailing vessels. Sailing vessels had the right of way under international law. Well, the steamers are trying to maintain a schedule back and forth, and here comes this great big windjammer, full sail, making knots. They'd make 15, 18 knots coming up the English Channel, and they would have to stop the steamer and let the sailing vessel go by, and the captain of the steamer would say, oh God, here comes another one of these damned old windjammers. So that's where the term came from. Down through the ages, big vessels, eventually small vessels, anything under sail was called a windjammer. We like to think of the windjammers as being the old coasters, the old sailing vessels without engines that are here in this unique business here on the coast of Maine. And it is a very unique business. Nowhere else in the world can you go and find vessels without engines doing things just like Granddaddy did back in the late 19th century. Now, back in the old days, there weren't any roads. Of course, the roads were all cow paths. There was no way to move cargo except by water. It was very easy to move by water. You could take a vessel, load her up with all kinds of cargo, and whether she got in next week or the week after didn't really matter. So there wasn't any kind of a schedule that you had to maintain with any great variance. Instead, a sailing vessel would be a lot of fun to take out on the water and make knots and move your cargo quite swiftly from one port to another.
The golden age of sail with the deep sea vessels was 1840s to about 1900, and then the schooner age was on either end, the coasting schooners.
And they were ubiquitous. There were sailing vessels everywhere. You can't imagine how many sailing vessels there were back in those days. The late 1800s, 1891, 1892, 1893, Rockland was the fourth largest seaport in the United States. That's Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Rockland, Maine. Why? Because there was no other transportation worthwhile. You couldn't get to Maine any other way. And this whole New England coast was populated. And US 1 ran from lighthouse to lighthouse all the way up and down east to Eastport, up to Boston. They say down east because that was the prevailing wind back in those days, sou'westers. The vessels all ran before the wind to come along the coast of Maine, which is mostly east and west. That's why they called it down east.